Wow. You really feel as if you could live out here. Or you could even work out here. When you dig a little deeper, you can find stories about how people really live in this brave new world. This is Charlie from Wigan. He wants work, needs money to pay his bills, rent, to put food on the table. He had a job in Asda, but he lost his job, and at this point is on welfare, which only gave him...
You're left with about a tenner.
What scares us the most is losing what we have. But what if we have nothing? Yet when he finally does get a job, it makes him worse off than he was when he was on the welfare system.
You are required to leave the below address after the 4th of October 2019. And how much do you owe your landlord?
2,475.
So what has all this got to do with the causes of Brexit? Poverty. Let's have a listen to how Charlie voted in the Brexit referendum.
Did you vote in the referendum 3 years ago?
Yeah, I voted to leave.
Tell me why you voted for leave.
Hopefully we can get some jobs back in.
That was in your head when you voted leave?
Yeah.
Somehow it would mean that there might be more for a town like this.
Charlie was sold a lie that if they got rid of immigration, if they got rid of immigrants, jobs would come back to the area because he would have less to compete with. If you don't believe me, let's have a listen to Nigel give simple solutions to complicated problems, and all of his solutions seem to be get rid of immigrants.
The question is, how do we fund the NHS? And if up to £2 billion a year is being lost on health tourism, surely that is a very real problem.
In your world, every problem is caused by immigrants.
You're blaming immigration, but we have a market-led housing policy over the past decade or more. That hasn't delivered homes.
There is an explanation. It's not immigration. It's government policy towards poverty.
That we don't repeat the mistake of the last great crisis, the last great economic recession in 2008, when the recovery was not uniform across all parts of society.
And those at the top have never done better. But average wages have barely budged. Inequality has deepened. Upward mobility has stalled. The cold hard fact is that even in the midst of recovery, too many Americans are working more than ever just to get by, let alone to get ahead.
You've heard Boris, you've heard Obama, both talking about wages not going up. When does that happen? 2008 and the 2008 crash. But is it the crash?
The bottom 20% in Britain, while I was Chancellor, did better. Their wages rose more quickly than at any previous period in British history.
In the state in which the UK was, very strong fiscal austerity, and the numbers were very scary, was the wrong decision.
A new and alarming phenomenon. Thousands of people going to US-style food banks because they can't afford to feed themselves.
Life is really tough under the Conservatives.
And look, in terms of the food bank issue, and I've studied the Trussell Trust data, what they tend to find is the typical user of food bank is not someone that's languishing in poverty, it's someone who has a cash flow problem episodically. No, it's true. Well, that is what the Trussell Trust data says.
This is Dominic Raab, a Conservative MP who frankly just doesn't read documents. I've got him on record not reading the Good Friday Agreement. He didn't understand that Dover was really important for trade, and he didn't read anything in terms of the collapse of Afghanistan. Lo and behold here, he doesn't have a clue about the Trussell Trust, who had to release this after those comments were made by Dominic Raab. This is the Trussell Trust response. Food banks in the Trussell Trust network gave out nearly 1.2 million three-day emergency food supplies to people in crisis, and our data shows that the main reasons for food bank referral are delays and changes to benefits and low income issues. They include people who are struggling with low pay or insecure forms of employment. Things got so bad in the United Kingdom that eventually the United Nations had to come in and offer donations to councils because the Conservative government just didn't want to believe that Britain, London, was poor. Today's video is sponsored by my book, What to Do in Oxford, an imagination tour, a guide to the town of Oxford and its city centre, available at Amazon, Blackwell's, W.H. Smith and all good bookstores. It's the old age problem. What do you do in a recession? Banks print money.
Quantitative easing was a sort of strange term, and it was quite interesting. When it was first used in Parliament by Alistair Darling, a lot of MPs said, "What is it? What's quantitative easing? Does anybody know? And they all went around saying quantitative easing is a very good thing. Most of them hadn't got a clue what it was.
The Bank of England creates money, and with that money, it needs to have some sort of value, which used to be gold. But instead, it buys government bonds from banks and other financial institutions. The idea is that the banks stop from collapsing and they have money to lend people and businesses. That's the theory. But does it work? What you also see is that borrowing goes up from 2008, and that devalues everything. So a simple way of looking at it is, if we had a set of diamonds, and they're the only diamonds in the world, they're in theory going to be worth a fortune. And if we have millions and millions of diamonds all over the place, all over the streets, suddenly they all become worthless. The same principle applies to money.
QE is really difficult, this printing money, because its purpose is that people who already have something, like a house or a pension or some shares, will see the value of those things go up. That's what the policy is designed to do. And it feels unfair because the people who don't have those things aren't getting the benefits of the policy. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion, it's better to try and keep the economy floating rather than let everything crash.
Now this is just lazy governance. There are 1,000 things he could have done in order to help people like Charlie. If it had been me, I would have set up a state bank. QE would have bought bonds in the bank. Every UK citizen would have been given an account. All welfare payments would have been paid through this account. It would have offered loans at low interest rates, and bank accounts would have paid a 5% interest rate per annum. That way money is helping with social mobility, you're passing it on to the public instead of to the rich, and then on top of that, one of the things proven to increase social mobility is easy credit. Just have a listen to this share trader when he talks about the rich and how they won't boost the economy.
These rich people are not going to boost the economy because they get the money. All they're doing is buying houses, buying stocks and shares. So what's probably going to happen is house price is going to go up, stock price is going to go up, the economy is not going to recover. And I started to bet very heavily that actually there will never be a recovery. On the back of this bet that there will never be an economic recovery, I became Citibank's globally most profitable trader in foreign exchange and short-term interest rate.
And this is where you get someone like Nigel Farage coming in with simple solutions to complex problems. And instead of blaming the government, he goes for immigrants. The solution isn't getting rid of ourselves from the EU. The solution is putting in a government that actually understands basic economics and is out to look out for those who are poorest and for the common person within Britain.
Tell me why you voted for Leave.
Hopefully we can get some jobs back in.
That was in your head when you voted Leave?
Yeah.
Somehow it would mean that there might be more for a town like this.
So remember, we now have a situation where wages are going down, but from what was said earlier, house prices are starting to go up, and it was even exacerbated by the Help to Buy programme. That doesn't just mean that house prices are going to go up. It means that the price of rents are going to go up. And again, we see Charlie struggling. Yet while all of this is taking place, we get to see that the wealth of the very rich just continues to grow. Because money attracts money.
I'm a nurse who I can't manage on the salary I have. I have to go to food banks.
That money isn't going to the public, it's going to banks through the Bank of England buying bonds. That money doesn't stick around in the UK, it goes abroad. That's what we discover through the Panama Papers. Money attracts money, and that money went to the richest. And the richest 1% in Britain were now earning 20 times the amount of the poorest 12 million Britons. While the rich got richer, this money wasn't distributed to the poor. Have a listen.
I think what was really the most nail-biting moment of the coalition was that the plan just wasn't working for the first couple of years. It just wasn't working.
Seems to be the growth of the working poor, and these are people who have had their hours cut or who have very recently lost their jobs as a result of the hard economic times.
By 2015, 2016, Britain was booming. And if you can't live within your means then, what hope have you got if the economy turns down again? I think there's an argument you hear, which is we're growing and things are doing well, so we can afford to spend more money. And then when things are bad, they go, we're doing badly, so we need to spend more money. In other words, there's always got an argument for spending more money. The harder thing is to say, actually, now's the time when we need to cut back a little and live within our means.
And there you have it. You have the reverse economic policy that any economist would ever recommend. Spending should take place when the economy is down in order to get the economy to bounce back up and stop extreme poverty. And this is one of the issues that takes place in the 1930s in Europe. Austerity breeds evil.
I know it has been hard for families since the crash. It's not a case of not understanding these difficulties. It's a case of being honest about why things are difficult. So here's another hard truth. Welfare cannot be protected from further substantial cuts.
So there was money kicking around through the taxpayer and the Bank of England. But what was it being invested in? Well, one is housing, which is going to cause a housing price increase. Or stocks and shares. If you invested in either of these things during this period, you would have made a lot of money. Thus the reason for the billionaires. Except the problem is, that's not where the money was needed. It should have been loaned out to the average British citizen, which would have stimulated the economy and jobs. And whilst all that was going on, we were becoming more and more aware that a lot of big companies weren't paying their taxes.
Pay your tax. Tax the rich, not the poor. Tax the rich, not the poor. Tax the rich, not the poor. Tax the rich.
Over the last 200 years, Britons have been fighting for working rights. Yet unfortunately this had all been brushed aside with 0-hour contracts. A device that was meant to be used for temporary workers, something that I even experienced as a teacher. And we've seen an explosion ever since 2015, causing brutal instability to anyone who has to suffer through those contracts, yet giving extraordinary amount of powers to businesses to be able to hire and fire people when necessary, instead of doing the traditional thing of offering a part-time contract. What you're seeing in front of you are text messages that Charlie has received from a 0-hour contract agency company that continues to send him random messages either at midnight the night before he goes into work or first thing in the morning, telling him that he's not needed. It is impossible to budget on that. That means you have no stability in even paying your rent, nonetheless keeping yourself alive. Have a listen to what Charlie says about budgeting with that problem.
But how can you even budget through the week?
Can't budget during the week.
Hundreds of years have been fought. People have died for rights which have been pushed aside very quickly through 0-hour contracts. And if you're not convinced by me, let's have a listen to the Greek finance minister from 2015, as well as Steve Bannon.
The little people suffer greatly, more and more and more. They have to accept third-rate quality jobs, if any, whereas the rich are fabulously more wealthy than they were before.
Just look at the math. You've had the greatest concentration of wealth in the history of the world on people's backs. And it's not right, it's unfair, and I would say it's actually evil.
And this brings us full circle to Charlie's story.
People were feeling a sense of public service cuts, they were feeling a sense of wage stagnation, they were feeling that household incomes had been damaged. And they wanted to push back and ultimately, I think, kick the establishment.
Before 2008, the majority of the people in Britain were sold the lie that they would become rich through financialization in the City of London. After 2008, the same people who were offering them that lie went in overdrive, bailing out the City of London at their expense. They were angry. They would vote for anything that pissed off, excuse my French, the elites.
And here we come full circle. We're being told, finally, a truth. It was nothing to do with immigration, as Nigel Farage repeatedly said. It was to do with an extraordinarily bad economic system that literally pushed people into poverty and desperation. People like Charlie, and have a listen to this gentleman.
The rights that you have as a worker have come from Europe.
You've changed the world!
The EU.
If this was one of your reasons for voting for Brexit, you've been sold a lie. The causes were nothing to do with the EU or immigration. Nigel Farage was way off the mark and leading you down a racist path. The issues, the problems, all stem from an awful economic policy that pumped billions into the economy that went straight into the pockets of the rich, paid for by taxpayers like you and me. Because of that money being pumped into the rich, they invested in housing, which meant housing prices went up, meaning that you and I couldn't afford a house. that rent prices went up, standards went down, and deregulation became a norm. And to boot, the EU set basic standards such as the working directive that stops you having to work over 40 hours a week by your boss. And instead you're now lumbered with a thing called a 0-hour contract. But don't kick yourself too hard, because these problems have happened in the past and people have been suckered into them by the likes of Mussolini and Hitler. And especially so with Hitler, who said that the problems that were causing the economic damage to Germany wasn't the German government or World War I, it was the Jewish population. It was the migrants. Before we get to the end of my video, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, and if you'd also like to have your name up on there, please sign up to Patreon. The link is in the description. Otherwise, if you fancy buying me just a single coffee, please click on my Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. But there is hope within all of this, and even Charlie began to see that by the end of his long journey, which was filmed over a 6-month period. Have a listen.
But you want Brexit to happen?
Well, I wanted to leave. The leave what I wanted has been twisted.
If there was a ballot paper in front of you now, would leave or remain, which one would you?
I'd just pick remain.
Would you?
Just for all this to stop.
And it isn't just Charlie regretting voting to leave. If you want to see more clips of people like Charlie saying they regret that, you have to watch my Brexit regret video. To watch it, click on the link in the description or at the end of the video. Britain is beautiful, and there is so much opportunity and possibility with this country. But it's also important to remember we're all human, and it's easy to get led down quite an evil path. Especially when more money's been pumped into this than any other election in history, especially when the message is repeated for 25 years, drip-fed into your head. Just remember, change is always possible, especially in democracy.